Welcome to Norse Mythology, the unofficial guide. It's unofficial because I'm neither a credentialed academic nor a time-traveling medieval Norse pagan, but I deal with this material directly from the sources, interpreted through the lens of the experts and their opinions. If you're looking for depth and detail in a simple and accessible way, then you're in the right place. Svaltegar munselju salts weithblindagaltar, rafkastandi rasta raurthwängs munalengi. This beautiful stanza is a fragment of a poem by a poet named Hallar Stein from somewhere around the year 1200. It can be translated as follows. The thrower of the amber, of the salty cool meadow of the boar of Weithblindi, will for a long time remember the willow of the path of the reed thong. If that's hard to understand, that's okay. Just remember how strange and obscure it sounds, and we'll come back to it a little later. In the last episode, we talked about the genesis of the gods, drawing heavily on a poem called Voluspa, as well as a 13th century work called the Prose Edda by famous historian Snorri Sturluson. There's a lot of context in there that we need going forward, so before we move on, let's quickly recap. Before the world was, there were Niflheim and Muspel, two regions of the cosmos separated by an empty void called Ginnungagap. Niflheim was to the north. It was misty and cold, and as the poisonous vapor given off by its rivers continually froze, it created layer upon layer of rime that slowly stretched southward across the void until it came close enough to the intense heat from Muspel that it began to melt, and eventually formed itself into the shape of a man. This man was Ymir, the first being, and Snorri tells us that he was evil, although Snorri never tells us anything evil that Ymir actually did. What he does tell us is that Ymir reproduced asexually, giving birth to the beings called Hrimthursar, more commonly called frost giants, although they were never actually thought of as gigantic beings as a class. The melting rime also formed a cow called Althumla that subsisted on licking the salty rimestones it formed from. After 3 days of licking, it licked out the form of a second man, Buri, who seems to have married one of Ymir's descendants. This union produced a son, Bor, who also married someone that was probably one of Ymir's descendants, and had 3 sons himself, Odin, Vili, and Ve. These 3 are the first members of the clan of beings the Norse call gods. Although Ymir is not genetically dissimilar from them, and even though he seems to be just as much their grandfather as Buri is, the reason Ymir wasn't a god, Snorri says, is because he was evil. As the story now continues, the first notable act performed by these 3 good gods is to kill Ymir. What their method of murder was exactly, we don't know. We also have no specific context as to why they felt he deserved to die. But as Ymir falls, so much blood flows from his wounds that it drowns the entire family of Hrimthursar, except for a character named Bergelmir and his wife, who managed to climb aboard a ship and avoid drowning in this sanguine flood. And because Bergelmir survives, the families of Hrimthursar are eventually able to repopulate. You may notice that this sounds strikingly similar to a certain biblical story about a man named Noah escaping a worldwide flood with his family in an ark, which brings up a great opportunity to talk about Christian influence and bias in our sources. By the time this story reaches the English language, it's already gone through a series of translations. One of those is from language to language, but the other is from cultural mindset to cultural mindset, as it's been transmitted across 1,000 years of time. In the Faulkes translation of the Prose Edda, we actually end up with the English phrase, "He went up onto his ark" with his wife and was preserved there. It uses language that makes it almost impossible not to equate this with the story of Noah's Ark. When Snorri delivers this story, he does so in the format of a conversation between 3 enthroned wizards and a disguised king in Sweden calling himself Gangleri. These wizards, who I like to call the Highs because their names are High, Justice High, and Third, are explaining Norse mythology to Gangleri, and in this case, they direct him to a stanza from a poem called Vafthrudnismál, which effectively functions as Snorri citing a source for his claims. Here's that stanza from Carolyne Larrington's translation. Uncountable winters before the world was made, then Bergelmir was born. That I remember first, when the wise giant was first laid in his coffin. This English translation, "the wise giant was first laid in his coffin," is so different from Snorri's interpretation that it essentially delivers the opposite message. Whereas Snorri believes this stanza references Bergelmir surviving a flood of blood in a ship, Larrington's translation seems to be describing Bergelmir's death. So how do we get such radically different interpretations? For one, it's possible that Snorri was aware of an oral tradition that no longer survives and caused him to interpret Vafthrûdnismál through that lens. Another possibility is that he invented this interpretation himself. In either case, Larrington asserts that Snorri's interpretation is borrowed from Christianity. Comprehending it hinges on interpreting the Old Norse phrase var luðr of lagidr, where lagidr means to be laid down or placed, and luðr is, in a literal sense, a reference to a wooden flour bin that serves as part of a hand milling device. So what exactly does it mean to be laid in a flour bin, or a mill box, as it's sometimes translated? Larrington clearly sees this as a poetic reference to a body being laid in a coffin. However, she alerts us in a footnote to the fact that other scholars have interpreted this as a cradle instead of a coffin, implying maybe that the stanza in Vafthrûdnismál refers to a remembrance of ancient times, so far in the past that this famous Bergelmir character was still a baby. Not to take all the credit away from Snorri, it's worth noting that the poem Grógaldr does use this word as a poetic reference for a ship. In that poem, the hero Sweepdog visits the grave of his mother, Groa, calling on her to awaken from the dead and chant magic spells for him that will protect him on a dangerous journey that he's about to embark on. She does awaken, and in stanza 11, she says, "The sixth one I will chant for you. If you come to the sea, running higher than men can stand, may calm and quiet ocean run together for you in the mill box, and may more peaceful voyages lie ahead for you." The issue with Snorri's interpretation, however, is that Bergelmir is laid into the mill box, which sounds a lot more like something that would happen to a corpse or a baby, and not so much a description of a man actively escaping a flood. So it's clear that some amount of Christian influence has crept into our source material, and particularly into those pieces that were composed long after Christianization had occurred. But it's not always easy to determine exactly which points scattered throughout the material are not original to the pagan tradition, and that becomes even harder when additional layers of Christian influence are added by translators. My recommendation, especially for Westerners like myself who have been chiefly exposed to Abrahamic religions all of our lives, is to be skeptical anytime one of these later sources says something that sounds too religiously familiar. Now, I'm not saying that every instance of a familiar-sounding concept must be Christian influence, just that the ancient Norse religion had very different ideas about deity, morality, the afterlife, and cosmology than we see in modern takes on Abrahamic religions. So when Snorri starts talking about how good and evil men are judged and apportioned in the afterlife, or when his descriptions of certain mythological creatures start sounding a little too much like angels and demons, or for that matter, when modern Reconstructionist gurus online treat Norse gods like caring, omniscient, paternal or maternal figures who are always looking out for your best interests, those would all be good moments to take a step back and do a bit of deeper research to determine whether or not these things are actually original to the pagan tradition. Getting back to the story, the Hais tell Gangleri that Odin and his brothers took Ymir's corpse into the middle of Ginnungagap and began to make things out of his body parts. His flesh was converted into earth, his bones and teeth were converted into rocks and stones, his blood was used to form lakes and an enormous sea, which is nearly impossible to cross, and was set such that it encircles the whole earth. So at this point, the description of Norse cosmology we have places Niflheim in the far north, the earth surrounded by a great sea in the middle, and Muspel in the far south, all on what appears to be a flat plain, as far as we can tell. Deep within the earth, which had been made from the corpse of Ymir, maggots had begun to take shape and acquire life. When the gods saw this, they determined that these maggots should be given consciousness and intelligence, and should be reshaped in the likeness of humans. Once these changes were made, the maggots became what the Norse call dwarves. And we'll talk more about mythical creatures like elves and dwarves in the future. For now, it's sufficient to note that, despite all of their upgrades, the dwarves continue to live within the earth and within rocks. 4 of these dwarves, named Austri, Vestri, Nordri, and Sudri, which very clearly mean east, west, north, and south, were positioned at 4 extreme points along the edges of the earth and were tasked with holding up a dome-shaped sky, which the gods fashioned from Ymir's skull, and which they filled with all the lights of the heavens created from sparks that were flying uncontrollably out of the heat and flames from Muspel. This imagery of uncontrolled sparks flying out of Muspel feels very Icelandic in nature, coming to us from a country that is home to frequent volcanic eruptions that spew just these types of molten sparks into the sky. It's the first detail that really starts to clue us into the idea that many of these points may be specific to an Icelandic version of the story, and if so, could indicate that different versions might have been held by Norse pagans elsewhere. There's also quite a bit more we could say about the sun and the moon and about day and night here, but we'll save that for another episode. At this point in the story, Gangleri is astonished by everything he's just been told. He remarks that the sky is an amazingly large construction and that it is skillfully made. But he wants to know more about how the Earth is arranged. So the Highs reiterate that the Earth is circular around the edge and encompassed by a great sea, and they add that on the outer side of this donut-shaped sea, there is a shoreline where the gods gave lands to the families of Jotnar. But on the inner side, they built a fortification around the Earth using Ymir's eyelashes to protect against any Jotun hostility, and they called this protected area Miðgarðr, which you will commonly hear pronounced as Midgard. It means literally the middle enclosure. For the finishing touches on this world they've just created, the gods take Ymir's brains and they throw them up into the sky, where they become clouds. And it's at this point that we finally come up against the culminating event in the creation story, which happens almost like an accident or an afterthought in Snorri's account. High says to Gangleri, quote, "As Bor's sons walked along the seashore, they came across 2 logs and created people out of them. The first gave breath and life, the second consciousness and movement, the third a face, speech, and hearing and sight. They gave them clothes and names. The man was called Ask, the woman Embla, and from them were produced the mankind to whom the dwelling place under Midgard was given. After that, they made themselves a city in the middle of the world, which is known as Asgard. We call it Troy. There the gods and their descendants lived, and there took place, as a result, many events and developments both on earth and aloft." End quote. In the last episode, I mentioned that words like under and over in our sources don't always have to be taken as literally as they would be in English. And I bring it up again here because these otherwise innocuous words have been the source of some major headaches for a lot of people trying to wrap their heads around the shape of Norse cosmology. In this case, the Highs explain that mankind are given a dwelling place under Miðgarðr, and then in the very next sentence, we are told that the gods create for themselves a city in the middle of the world called Osgardr, which, as Snorri thinks of it, is Troy. On the one hand, the gods are living in this place in Miðgarðr, and on the other hand, humanity is given a dwelling place under Miðgarðr, but then again, the gods are living in Troy, which is a place where humans live, and a place around which humans live. So the point is, we don't need to look at a phrase like this one, dwelling place under Midgard, which does come from undir in Old Norse, by the way, and assume that it must literally mean underneath or below. In this case, maybe we can interpret it something like under the purview of Miðgarðr, or under the larger umbrella of Miðgarðr. But the idea I want to get across is that at some point you may find it interesting to try and put together a picture in your own mind of how all the locations in Norse mythology relate to each other. But if you get hung up on these words like under and over, which occur all over these descriptions, they will only be confusing for you if you try to take them literally the way we would in English. What's interesting is we also see some of Snorri's personal conception of cosmology here, when he mentions that many events took place both on Earth and aloft. Snorri will tell us later in so many words that Osgardr is up in the sky, although just now he's told us it's another name for Troy. He's not a perfectly consistent source, and he will directly contradict himself from time to time. Rudolf Simek notes that the word Osgardr shows up far less frequently in the Poetic Edda than it does in Snorri's writings, and was probably originally thought to be part of Miðgarðr, as opposed to some other heavenly dimension as it's popularly depicted these days. There would have been essentially the world within the enclosure and the world without. Midgardr and Utgardr. More importantly, we're told here about the creation of mankind. As Snorri describes it, Odin and his two brothers Vili and Ve are walking along the beach and discover two pieces of driftwood, upon which they bestow breath, life, consciousness, movement, faces, speech, hearing, and sight. And then, having created a man and a woman, they give their creations clothes and finally names, specifically Oskr for the man, which means ash tree, and Embla for the woman, which is a word that's a little trickier to decipher. The most prominent theory about what Embla means is that it may derive from an older root meaning elm tree. But most scholars are hesitant about this theory because it would require a pretty drastic linguistic evolution, though one that isn't impossible. Another theory is that it derives from a word meaning vine, and could be related to the Greek ampelos. But it's a weird word to say the least, and it isn't the common Old Norse word for elm tree. That word is almr. But this detail about human beings being created from driftwood is another strongly Icelandic detail. For another slightly different version of the story, we can turn again to Völuspá. Stanzas 17 and 18 read, "Until three gods, strong and loving, came from out of that company. They found on land, capable of little, ash and embla, lacking in fate. Breath they had not, spirit they had not, blood nor bearing, nor fresh complexions. Breath gave Odin. Spirit gave Honir, blood gave Loder, and fresh complexions." There's nothing stopping us from interpreting the phrase here, found on land, the way Snorri does, meaning as driftwood washed up on a beach, although it's certainly not as explicit here as it is in Snorri's account. Christopher Abram notes that one of the most immediate and significant consequences of the Norse settlement of Iceland was deforestation, with nearly all forests being wiped out possibly within the lifespans of the first generations of settlers. Reforestation efforts, of course, began to catch on in the 20th century, and Iceland's forests are now reappearing. But Abram explains that in the medieval period, driftwood became an increasingly important resource, as it provided some utility that native forests no longer could. What he calls the, quote, happy accident of the creation of human beings, end quote, therefore has a distinctly Icelandic flavor, following the tradition of making something useful out of whatever washes up on shore. There are also some distinct differences between Snorri's account and the account in Völuspá. Whereas Snorri lists the three gods who create humans as Odin, Vili, and Ve, Völuspá lists them as Odin, Honir, and Lodur. What's a little bit interesting about this is that both pairs, Vili and Ve and Honir and Lodur, are pairs of relatively obscure characters. There have been some attempts made to reconcile these names, but that's a rabbit hole probably not worth getting lost in at this point. For now, it's probably fine to accept the idea that just because these two different pairs appear alongside Odin in two different versions of the creation story, doesn't necessarily mean they are actually the same characters under different names. The sooner we accept this idea that there was never a universal dogmatic canon of Norse mythology in ancient times, the easier it will be to digest the mythology, and the more interesting it will become. One other fascinating point about the version in Völuspá is the phrase that Larrington translates to fresh complexions. In Old Norse, this phrase is litu golda, and it means something more literally like goodly hue. What makes this interesting is that scholars usually make a correction to the source manuscripts here, where they add an accent mark over the O in Goða, which doesn't exist in the original texts. That accent mark is the difference between goodly hue and hue of the gods. If the accent mark was deliberately omitted in the original, then it's possible this phrase was meant to mean something more along the lines that mankind was crafted to resemble the gods. But it's worth digging in more to this idea that humans were made out of wood, because the association of humans with trees, and actually the blatant equivalence between humans and trees, is rampant in our poetic sources. Christopher Abram goes so far as to say that whereas we are used to thinking of humanity as a branch of the animal kingdom, Norse poetic culture regarded people as a species of feeling tree. He points out that, quote, whenever a tree word appears in a skaldic stanza, its audience knows at once to expect not a leafy source of nuts or firewood, but a person. Any tree, any name of a tree, or any word for tree potentially can stand in for any human figure, end quote. In a previous episode, I mentioned that this type of poetry can be nearly impossible to decipher for someone without an education in what Abram called here the poetic culture. One extremely important tool in the arsenal of a poet, or skald in Old Norse, is the kenning, which is essentially like a micro-riddle that skalds can employ in order to reference concepts that would otherwise not fit within the poetic rules, while still adhering to things like alliteration and meter. A simple and classic example is the phrase whale road, being used instead of the more simple words sea or ocean. The sea is easily conceptualized as something like a road for whales, but quite frequently, kennings will reference concepts from mythology and can become a lot more obscure. For example, we might read about a warrior carrying around a hall shingle. If we are unaware of the fact that the roof of Odin's hall is made of shields, it will be hard to figure out that the warrior is just carrying around his shield, instead of a literal shingle. Kennings can be beautiful and evocative too, such as when a sword is referenced as a fish of battle. It evokes imagery of this sleek object glinting in the sunlight as it darts back and forth through a sea of enemies. With that in mind, some kennings for human beings include such phrases as pine tree of the fastened fire of the fish expanse. This extremely weird phrase just means beautiful woman, where pine tree tells us we're talking about a person, and fire of the fish expanse, that is, fire of the sea, refers to gold, which here denotes beauty. A few more examples include shield danger-wielding grove with hair for foliage, meaning warrior, beautifully adorned oak of coins, also meaning woman, and ash firs of the god Ullr, meaning men. But as Abram points out, while kennings are sometimes thought of as metaphorical, especially in this general sense, a tree can also be viewed as a direct substitute for man without the need for these types of gaudy modifiers. In those cases, we don't have to think of it in metaphorical terms. The tree and the man might as well be one and the same. This is probably a good time to revisit the stanza from Hallarstein that I recited at the beginning of this episode. The thrower of the amber of the salty cool meadow of the boar of Viðblindi will for a long time remember the willow of the path of the reed thong. In other words, the generous man will for a long time remember the woman, who in this case is referred to as a willow tree. It may be easier at this point to parse other pieces of this stanza as well. For example, the salty cool meadow is very clearly a reference to the sea. The god Odin describes once again turning trees into humans by providing them with sentience and clothing in a poem called Havamal. Havamal means the sayings of the High One, so we usually believe the intent is that the entire poem is supposedly narrated by Odin himself. In stanza 49, he says, "My clothes I gave out in the field to 2 wooden men, champions they thought themselves when they had clothing. The naked man is despised." The word Larrington translates to wooden men here is træmenn, which can be more literally translated as just tree people. At first glance, it may appear that Odin is describing a second instance of forming trees into people by gifting them clothes, which is possible. But it seems to me there's also the possibility that this could be a brief reference to another forgotten version of the original creation story, this time taking place in a field rather than on a beach with driftwood. Joseph S. Hopkins notes in his article Sacred Tree and Holy Grove that way before the Viking Age, somewhere near the end of the 1st century AD, the Roman author Tacitus, or Tacitus as you may have heard it pronounced, wrote a book called Germania, where he noted that the Germanic tribe called the Semnones, who he asserts are the oldest of the Germanic tribes, believe they originated from a grove of trees. Everything Tacitus says has to be taken with a grain of salt, of course, but later on, when we get into the cataclysmic end of the world called Ragnarok, there will be another 2 humans that survive the apocalypse by hiding either in a forest or within the trunk of a tree, from which they will reemerge once the earth is renewed. This idea seems to recall Tacitus's narrative a little bit, and possibly portrays an idea a little closer to ancient Germanic beliefs. And who knows, maybe even more common beliefs outside of Iceland. It seems that, as Hopkins puts it, all roads lead to trees. We as people are descended from trees, we are interchangeable with trees, our species will escape extinction by returning to trees, and after this age of the world has ended, we will reemerge from trees once again. This is an especially powerful sentiment coming from a place like Iceland that, by the time these stories were written down, was effectively treeless. That sort of staying power illustrates the potency of tree symbolism in the Norse tradition. In fact, one of the clearest points we have on the shape of Norse cosmology is that all of creation seems to be organized around a single gargantuan ash tree. It's a tree whose roots mark the realms of the world, upon whose trunk the fates of humanity are carved, and from whose branches Odin once hung himself. And we'll dive into it next time on Norse Mythology, the Unofficial Guide. Sources for this episode include Dictionary of Northern Mythology by Rudolf Simek, 2010, Evergreen Ash, Ecology and Catastrophe in Old Norse Myth and Literature by Christopher Abram, 2019, Sacred Tree and Holy Grove by Joseph S. Hopkins, 2020 from mimisbrunnr.info, The Poetic Edda, translated by Carolyne Larrington, 2014, and the Prose Edda, translated by Anthony Faulkes, 1995.